bracing themselves for the aerial onslaught that would pave the way for the Nazi invasion. RAF Fighter Command was ready to be the sword and shield against this airborne onslaught, thanks to the leadership, determination and foresight of its commander, Sir Hugh Dowding, a man who was never given the recognition he deserved for laying the foundations for victory in the Battle of Britain. In the spring of 1940, Europe was collapsing under the weight of Hitler's armed forces. The vast German war machine had overpowered Poland and Czechoslovakia. Now they swept into France. The Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command for the Royal Air Force was Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. Dowding's fighting force was in France attempting to stop the Germans overrunning the country. It was a losing battle. Nearly 500 fighters were destroyed and 300 pilots killed. This was a severe drain on the resources of Fighter Command.
We were hopelessly ill-equipped. We didn't all have maps. Only some of us had maps. There weren't enough to go around. And we'd no ground crew with us, so we had to do it all ourselves. Pump fuel in, pour it in from 2-gallon tins.
The army, who were on the beaches at the time trying to get out, were slating the RAF Fighter Command somewhat because they said they never saw any fighters overhead. What they didn't realize, of course, that if we intercepted their bombers over them, it would be too late. They'd be dropping their bombs on them. So we had to intercept them way inland.
France was desperate for reinforcements, and Churchill was about to give in to their requests. But Dowding had other ideas and would clash with his superiors, something he was well known for.
Sirs, in my view, Fighter Command will be pushed to the limit in protecting 11 and 12 groups. I would remind you that your estimate of the number of squadrons required for home defense was 52. I have, at present, 34 for the task.
During his time as an officer pilot in the First World War, he would often question the orders of his Commander-in-Chief, Lord Trenchard.
He had a very big row with Trenchard about his pilots. One of the squadrons, they'd taken quite a beating, and he asked for them to be taken out of the line to rest.
These boys could only win so many dogfights before they were caught out. They needed a break. I put my case, but received orders stating that we were to continue our offensive flights. Other roles in the Royal Flying Corps were rested after a while. If they could do it in other areas, I felt strongly that the rule should apply to pilots as well. I put my case to Trenchard.
Trenchard eventually gave in, but he then decided that Dowding was too soft to be a front-line commander, and shipped him back to England.
The protection of his men had effectively cost him promotion. But this protection was something that followed him into World War II and throughout his life.
It shows, I think, that he really was concerned as though they were his children almost, and he fought battles and battles for them. And the pilots were aware of this, and that's why they held him in such great affection.
In fact, his men affectionately nicknamed him Stuffy.
In the Royal Air Force, you could have a nickname for any reason at all that could be the opposite of what you were. But I think as a loner and a very reserved person, he would be unlikely to join in parties, and people would say, oh, he's a bit stuffy, you know. So the name stayed. Nicknames don't go away, I'm afraid.
In order to get on in the army, you need good capacity to drink well. I drink as little as possible. I have only been drunk twice in my life, and I remember the feeling afterwards well. That is why I do not drink like the others.
But between the wars, Dowding was continually promoted and was instrumental in forming the Royal Air Force. In 1936, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command. He was 53 years old and had reached the rank of Air Marshal. He was determined to build his baby into a premier fighting force whose objective was to defend the country at all costs. He was a pragmatist and a realist. He realized that Fighter Command was best employed protecting the country as a defensive force. And with the advent of war, his dream would be put to the test. Strongly opposed this plan.
I was desperately concerned with convincing the PM how urgent the situation was. I laid the data on the table in front of him and said, if the present rate of wastage continues for another fortnight, we shall not have another hurricane left in France or Britain. That did the trick.
It was decided to fall back from France and prepare for the defense of Britain. But some of Dowding's experienced pilots were left stranded.
It was all pretty chaotic, of course. We were in full retreat. We couldn't get any instructions or orders what to do. So we'd refuel and just go off, do a patrol, looking for trouble.
I made my way back by managing to get a lift on an old lorry, which had a load of potatoes in the back. I was going towards Cherbourg, and the roads were absolutely jammed up with refugees. They had horses towing their cars, and they had their cars loaded to the gills with all their belongings that they could take away. But of course it made our journey extremely hazardous because the roads were so blocked up. We landed at Southampton, and we went by train from there to Waterloo. Going up in the train, I was watching people playing cricket in their whites, and I could hardly believe it after what we'd been through.
The German High Command agreed that Britain must also be invaded in order to stop any further resistance to the Nazi onslaught. At the start of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had over 2,500 aircraft in its fighting fleet. By contrast, Fighter Command had barely 550 in flying condition. Dowding knew that his pilots lacked air combat experience, whereas the Germans were supremely confident. The Luftwaffe had blooded their pilots and planes in support of Franco's troops during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. By the beginning of the Second World War, the Luftwaffe had perfected tactics and formations.
Wir haben also schon im Polenfeldzug eben die Erfahrung sammeln können, dann im Frankreich-Feldzug, im sogenannten Frankreich-Feldzug die Luftkämpfe mit den Franzosen, die schon ganz gute Flugzeuge hatten, zum Teil auch aus Amerika geliefert. Da waren wir auch ganz gut vorbereitet. Außerdem hatten wir taktisch eine damals auch von den Engländern anerkannte bessere taktische Fliegerei.
None of us really knew how to fight aeroplanes. And the Germans had had the experience of the Spanish Civil War.
This experience in actual battle was put to devastating effect against the Polish Air Force at the outset of the war.
We were bombed on the planes, the people were killed, we were hiding in the fields.
We didn't give up. We tried to do our best all the time, but our best wasn't good enough by far.
They managed to overrun us. Of course, they have a lot of technical equipment, especially tanks and aircrafts.
And it was really a catastrophe. I mean, it was so unpleasant.
Not only did the Germans have the experience, they also had the hardware.
Da hatten wir die ersten Me 109 Flugzeuge, also das berühmte Jagdflugzeug. Und wir hatten die ersten Typen, das war noch ein relativ leichtes Flugzeug. Später wurde das ja wurden die Motoren immer stärker, das Flugzeug wurde mehr bewaffnet, stärker bewaffnet. Dann kamen entsprechende Funkeinrichtungen.
The odds were stacked against Hugh Dowding's fighter command.
I had travelled Germany many years before the war, had a lot of German friends, and they're a very, very formidable fighting power, there's no doubt about that.
As the small British fighting force braced itself for the Nazi onslaught, many pilots feared the worst.
They intended to really decimate this country and just use us as slave labor, I suppose, really.
Dowding and fighter command were all that stood between us and a fascist dictatorship.
If it was put to me bluntly, are we going to win this war? I think we should be bloody lucky if we do.
June 1940. The leader of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding, was tasked with defending Britain against the onslaught of Nazi Germany. His forces were short of planes and pilots, but were prepared to take on the battle-hardened pilots and their aircraft from the mighty Luftwaffe.
It was a vital battle. After all, the Germans wanted to invade us, and they couldn't have invaded us unless they'd got air superiority.
There was much at stake. Waiting across the channel were thousands of troop-carrying barges ready for the invasion. If Fighter Command lost control of the skies, the German invasion would have been unstoppable. Quite simply, Dowding had to win. But there was much in his favor. Since becoming Commander-in-Chief, he had tirelessly worked to establish a structure where communication was vital to every aspect of his control. Dowding had divided the country into 4 separate groups. 13 Group in the north, 12 Group guarding the east coast and the Midlands, 10 Group covering the west, and 11 Group responsible for defending London and the southeast of England. Each group had its own operations centre in direct communication with HQ Fighter Command at Bentley Priory on the outskirts of London. From here, Dowding would oversee the defence of Britain.
HQ Fighter Command monitored the whole of the United Kingdom. Dowding had responsibility for the air defence of the United Kingdom. His job was to ensure that the country was defended. So technically at HQ Fighter Command, it was a monitoring situation. Information being received, passed out to the groups and received back, so he could keep a tally on what was actually happening.
But good communication alone would never defeat the Nazis. Fortunately, Dowding had a secret weapon. While working for the Air Ministry, he pioneered the development of a long-range early warning system called Radio Direction Finding, RDF, or as it would become known, radar. By the outbreak of war, the system was up and running.
The whole world of radar was totally and completely secret, and nobody was allowed to know about it, and nobody ever did.
I cannot give you much information about this system because its existence is very secret. Suffice it to say that we are able to detect the approach of aircraft over the sea to a distance of 60 miles or more and to plot their courses with fair accuracy.
We had forewarning of the German formations, their size, their height, their direction. We had a lot of advanced information, so it was very important.
A series of masts known as chain home high and low covered south and eastern coasts at varying intervals. They were linked to filter stations, which passed the information onto sector stations and operations rooms.
I was trading on what was called CH radar, which was entirely in the business of defence. In other words, picking up bombers at 90 miles range before they ever started crossing the channel and heading in our direction. They were seen on the screen the moment they got up in the air.
Now, this was fed back to HQ Fighter Command at Bentley Priory into their filter room, where it was checked, filtered by filter officers, then passed to the group affected. It would give the controller time to get his aircraft airborne.
Okay, time to scramble.
Fighter Command's control with radar was first class from an interception point of view.
The controllers were able to assess which squadrons should intercept that particular formation and how many aircraft would be, or how many aircraft they estimated would be required to deal with that situation.
It meant that your squadrons could be kept on the ground until the very last minute. The alternative would be to put them up on patrol. And of course, this would have been quite hopeless.
You can't run a standing patrol system hour by hour, 24 hours a day and night sort of thing. Not with the resources we had.
But even this new early warning system had its limitations. Dowding still needed eyes from the ground, relaying the numbers of enemy aircraft to the stations.
Now, once the aircraft had crossed over the coastline, radar stopped. It only pointed seaward. And then, of course, it became the Observer Corps, whose priority was to track the aircraft and report that back simultaneously to HQ Fighter Command.
Somebody would tell you that there were 200 plus, 100 plus, 50 plus coming over. This was when we got warning from the coastal people that the raid was building up and coming over. And a raid did build up, like a thunderstorm.
It was very exciting to watch a raid beginning to build up 90 miles, 80 miles away. A few little echoes would appear on the screen to begin with. And then slowly it would get a bigger and bigger mass, and all these echoes are kind of trembling. So you would pass a plot to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, and there was old Stuffy Dowding sitting up in his balcony watching it all happen.
Man hat dann schon ein Unterlegenheitsgefühl. Und plötzlich kamen die Engländer von ganz in bester Position auf uns zugeflogen und haben uns angegriffen.
The Air Ministry were determined not to give away the fact that we had effective radar or something in our night fighter that allowed us to close in on other aircraft at night. The Air Ministry were pressed by newspapers as to why I had had success at night. The Air Ministry decided quite deliberately that they would say that I had exceptional night vision. And they told the Commander-in-Chief in Fighter Command that he was to make sure that I realized that's what they were saying. I was then given the name by the papers as Cat's Eyes Cunningham.
But the Germans were not so easily fooled.
Da wurde uns erstmal bewusst, dass da irgendeine Einrichtung sein muss, die also diese Führungsmöglichkeit ergibt. Und das hat man damals ja noch nicht so gewusst, dieses Radar.
The Germans quickly identified the large aerials along the coastline as Dowding's secret weapon, and soon found a way to penetrate our defences and attack them.
There was only one drawback to CH radar. It could not look low enough.
Jerry used to come in, probably 2 or 3 planes at a time, under the radar, and they used to, what we say, shoot us up. You'd suddenly hear the machine guns going, you think, oh my goodness, there's an enemy overhead. So everything would go chaotic because the guns would open up and the noise was horrific.
The Germans were gaining the upper hand. Dowding desperately needed another fighting advantage. The workhorse of fighter command was the Hurricane, which, although effective, had its limitations.
We couldn't chase anything with the Hurricane. All the German aircraft were much faster than we were.
There really was a war on, and our backs were to the wall, and by God, we needed aircraft.
But Dowding was already one step ahead. He was instrumental in the increased production of a new and iconic aircraft, the Spitfire.
One day there was a totally different noise in the sky, and I went out, and there, high up in the blue, were 2 beautiful monoplanes, wheeling and diving and circling around.
It's the most wonderful noise you can imagine. It's sort of rich and powerful and reassuring.
Spitfire was a real match for the Messerschmitt 109s. It gave the pilots of fighter command a much-needed advantage.
The Spitfire excelled under extreme conditions. It responded, whatever the conditions of flight, whatever the conditions of load, whatever the speed or angle, it would give you fair warning that it was being abused. And you could do things with a Spitfire that certainly I've never been able to do with any other aircraft.
One day, the Spitfire landed on the airfield and taxied over to our hangar, and we were told it was ours. And we sat in this thing, and we walked around it, we stroked it. I fell a bit in love with this airplane. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The next day, 15 more turned up, and we were a first one. Anyway,
although the Spitfire was faster and more maneuverable, it didn't supersede the Hurricane. In fact, the 2 planes complemented each other.
There's a split section between those that favour the Hurricane more than the Spitfire. But the fact of the matter is, the Battle of Britain could have been won by the Spitfire. But had we not had the Spitfire, the Hurricane could not have won it on its own.
But even with these 2 awesome fighting machines, Fighter Command was suffering the loss of 5 pilots per day. A fact that would play heavily on Dowding's mind. For many, fighting for the first time was an awakening. This was reality. Kill or be killed. It was a rite of passage for many who were still teenagers as they made their transition from boy to man. Throughout his time as Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding was concerned for the welfare of his pilots. As the defence of Britain began to get underway during July 1940, and because of the deaths of many of his pilots, his concern deepened.
It's very revealing that he referred to the pilots, who after all were, you know, fairly tough in their own way, and he referred to them as his chicks.
And the safety of his chicks was always at the top of Dowding's mind.
One day at our airfield,